Hi everyone. In this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at a game played between Harry Nelson Pillsbury and Siegbert Tarrasch. This was played in the 1902 Monte Carlo tournament in Monte Carlo, Monaco, and without further ado, let's look at this game. Pillsbury starts the game off by playing the move e4, and now e5 by Tarrasch. Knight f3, knight c6, and now bishop to b5, so the Roy Lopez. a6, bishop a4, knight f6, and after a few more moves of theory, we get to the closed variation of the Roy Lopez. Knight a5 by Tarrasch, attacking the bishop on b3, and most likely trying to exchange the knight for the bishop. h3 by Pillsbury, and here Tarrasch makes an interesting decision. He doesn't actually capture the bishop on b3, play bishop b7, and then castle. He instead plays the move castles already, and he actually has no intention of capturing the bishop on b3, mainly because of one reason. It's because it opens up the A file, and it also gives the idea of knight takes b5 from Pillsbury's perspective. And not only that, after this A takes b3 move is played, you have to, of course, play bishop b7, or at least develop the c8 bishop so that it can defend the a8 rook, or move it so that the queen defends the rook. So let's say bishop b7. After bishop e3, the development that Pillsbury has is slightly better than what Tarrasch has. Pillsbury has the semi-open A file, and it's hard for Tarrasch to really play defense and try to defend Pillsbury from ever capturing the a6 pawn. So it's better to just ignore the bishop for now and just castle, which is what Tarrasch did. We have knight e2 by Pillsbury, just trying to reroute his knight, and maybe also trying to play c3, just bring his bishop back to c2, who knows. And now we have c6 by Tarrasch. And c6 is an interesting move. Usually in the Roy Lopez, you'll see the move c5 being played more often. Why, you might ask? Because it controls the center a lot better than c6 does. So c6 nonetheless, it's not a bad move, it's just that c5 was better. But now we have knight g3 by Pillsbury. And Pillsbury wants to get his knight into either f5 or h5. We have queen c7, and after queen e2, and now c5 is played. And c5 is a bit of a questionable move played now, because you could have played c5 itself after knight e2 was played instead of playing c6. Now, what's really the difference? Nothing's the difference. It's most likely that Tarrasch thought that c6 first was better, but then he changed his mind later. Who knows? So after c5 was played, bishop d2, and now you're of course putting pressure on the a5 knight, and you might be wondering why Tarrasch still isn't going to capture the bishop on b3. Well, it's mainly because, yet again, the a file would be opened, but also the a5 square is a severe weakness in Tarrasch's camp, and allowing Pillsbury to occupy it is not a very good idea. Also, it's not a good idea for Tarrasch to develop his bishop to b7 now, because we see that there is the option for the knight on g3 to hop into f5. And now it's a bit of a question, is Tarrasch's position really the best? And let's look at that. Knight c6, of course, rerouting the knight, maybe the knight can go to d4, c3 preventing that idea, and now bishop e6. And bishop e6 is offering a trade of bishops, which may seem kind of weird, considering that the position you would get after the trade of bishops is a bit strange. Although it isn't that bad. If you do play bishop takes e6 and f takes e6, even though Pillsbury does have knight g5, gaining a tempo on the e6 pawn, after queen d7, which not only defends the e6 pawn, but also threatens the move h6, the idea of d5 being played is going to be a lot stronger. First of all, because d5 will allow a pawn to remain on the d5 square after e takes d5 and e takes d5, and also because it will potentially in the future give the bishop on e7 the good square of d6. So queen d7, after the bishop takes e6 and f takes e6 move, isn't exactly a bad idea. But instead of playing bishop takes e6, Pillsbury decides to play the move knight g5. And he's provoking a trade of bishops, but that only he would be benefited from it. Since after bishop takes b3, a takes b3, if you look at this now, the a file is open. h6 by Tarrasch, and the idea is that, of course, the knight should leave the g5 square. And now knight f3. So the knight moves back, but now we see that there is a severe problem in Tarrasch's position. And it's that the f5 square is very weak. And you can imagine that if this knight manages to hop to h4 and then this knight manages to hop into f5, then it could be bad, or if this knight just goes to f5 directly. But the problem is severe, and it's really hard to deal with it. You may be wondering why Tarrasch doesn't just simply play the move bishop d8, and once the knight hits the f5 square, you just play knight e7. I mean, you're just going to trade knights, and it's not going to be much different. Well, the problem is that after this knight comes to h4, capturing the knights isn't really a good sign. Because if you capture the knight, the other knight will replace it, and also because if you don't capture the knight and instead play something like g5, maybe trying to force this knight to go away, then there's a problem on your side as well. Because after bishop e7, knight f5, there's still a knight that managed to get into the f5 square, and now a pawn cannot even kick it away. Mainly because both the e and g pawns have been advanced, and also because it's going to take a while for this knight on f6 to come to a square where it could challenge this knight, but moreover, because you can't really move this knight at all, since if you move it, then you basically give the queen access to the h5 square. And one thing leads to another, and we can see that Pillsbury is immediately winning from this entire combination. So instead of playing bishop d8, rook fe8 was played instead, maybe trying to bring the bishop back and hopefully defend the position. Knight f5, bishop f8, g4, and then knight h7. Backing the knight up to mainly guard the g5 square, and waiting for the right moment to play something like knight e7 and g6 and all of that. So we have king h2, basically trying to include the f1 rook in the attack, and you may also be thinking that after rook g1, Pillsbury could even play rook g2 or rook g3, and he could include this a1 rook in the attack as well. So after this king h2 move was played, queen to d8 was played by Tarrasch. And Tarrasch is mainly trying to guard the g5 square, because it's the weakest square in the position, and if he allows Pillsbury to make use of it, then things can go downhill quite quickly. And here, Pillsbury actually had an opportunity to just play a very good move. And I encourage you to find the move. Okay, so the move that could have been played is actually g5. And what g5 is trying to do is it's trying to essentially give a weak pawn on g5, which will be quite easy for Pillsbury to attack. So let's say that you were going to play the move knight takes g5. Well, then you could play knight or bishop takes g5. Let's say knight takes g5 for this example. And after h takes g5, rook g1, this has already gone too far for Tarrasch. Since if he plays f6, then there's h4. And this position is just too bad. Let's say you go for g6, then after h takes g5, g takes f5, and now you could even play g takes f6 check. You could play queen h5. This has already gone too far. And you can tell that because if you play fg5 here, then after rook g5, bishop g7, and now you just capture the bishop. King takes g7, and let's say rook g1 check. If you just look at the activity that Pillsbury has, you will see and understand why g5 was a very good move. Pillsbury missed this opportunity, but then again, this position is already crushing for Pillsbury no matter which way you slice it. So rook g1. Not immediately going for the g5 idea, but getting ready to play it. And now g5 is a severe threat which Tarrasch must meet. And he plays knight g5. And the reason why I don't like this knight g5 move is because the knight is so vulnerable to attack that it can easily just flip out of the g5 square quite instantly. So what does Pillsbury do to take advantage of the knight? He plays h4. And the idea is that, well, of course, now the knight is attacked. Of course, Tarrasch wouldn't play a move like f6 and keep the knight there. So knight f3 check. Queen f3, and now g5. You must do your best to guard against the knight on f5. The knight on f5 is the strongest piece that Pillsbury has. And it's very hard to take advantage of it, mainly because if you try g6, then you just run into too many problems. For instance, bishop takes h6, and here you've already lost the game. If you play g takes f5, then after g takes f5 check, king h8, queen h5, this has already gone too far. And if you play, instead of g takes f5, bishop takes h6, then after knight h6 check, king g7, you could just play knight takes f7 or queen takes f7, but an even more interesting move would just be the simple g5. And it's just giving black no counterplay whatsoever. It establishes an outpost on the f6 square, and Tarrasch is already way behind the game. So instead, we have g5. Not a very good decision to make, but it's hard to suggest anything else for Tarrasch. Pillsbury opens up the h-file, and after king g2, it's clear that Tarrasch is not going to win the game. Rook e6 was played, because Tarrasch, of course, wants to try and using his rook, and his bishop, and his queen to all defend the king side. Rook h1 was played here, and here the move that essentially loses the game instantly. The better move to play here would have been the move rook g6, and it's mainly because you're trying to play the move bishop g7, and bishop g7 is a needed move to be played. One, because if knight takes g7 is played, after king takes g7, you've traded off the best attacker that white has. And also, because if that happens, then you have a running space for your king to go to. Your king can run to f8, e8, and perhaps, even though this is not the best idea, it could try and hide on this b7 square. So, maybe there is potential in this position if rook g6 was played. For instance, let's say queen h3, bishop g7, queen h7 check, king f8, and now a trade on the g7 square. Note that queen h8 check trying to force mate does not work because there's a rook on g6, and this is another reason why the rook g6 move would have been very nice, because you can just block this with rook g8, and now you're simply winning as black. So knight g7 would have to be played, rook g7, queen h8 check, rook g8, and now after queen h6 check, you would play the simple king e8, and after your queen comes to e7, your king comes to d7, and you bring this a8 rook into the game. Tarrasch still has chances of getting the position in his favor. However, after bishop g7, all of that hope just vanishes after Pillsbury's next move. So I encourage you to pause the video and try to find the move that Pillsbury played, which automatically wins the game. Okay, so Pillsbury played the move knight takes g7. And after this move was played, Tarrasch is already completely lost. The best move to play would actually been to decline the knight. But, of course, white can get a checkmating attack with or without the knight on f5, mainly because of the next move that Pillsbury has. He accepted the knight, but this is the move that you had to find in order to crush Tarrasch. It was rook to h7 check. And why is this move winning? Well, because it doesn't matter what move you play, queen takes f7 check is going to be the next move. Whether you play king g6, king g8, king f8, or even capture the rook like what was played in the game, queen takes f7 check is going to end in checkmate in a few moves. So here, after queen takes f7 check was played, Tarrasch resigned the game, and he resigned because if you play king h8, then there's rook h1 check, rook has to block, and now rook takes h6 is checkmate, or you could just play the move king to h6 here, but then it's a very much quicker checkmate with rook h1, so hence after the move queen takes f7 check, Tarrasch resigned the game, and a very brilliant victory to Harry Nelson Pillsbury. So I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comments section, and stay tuned for more chess.